Let me begin with the presidential race before we move to the far more ominous situation in Israel. And I think it's ominous because of the message that has been sent to Sinwar. I'll come back to that. But I have been arguing since the end of the CNN debate that stalled out the Harris campaign. It's been falling since. The data is beginning to come in to fill in with me. And I have been stealing shamelessly from Abe Greenwald, who said on the podcast, interviews are her kryptonite. I think she's got to get out there and do interviews to arrest her fall. But do you think she will?
I don't think she will do many interviews, Hugh, for exactly the reason that Abe mentioned and you just mentioned there, that interviews are her kryptonite. Interviews don't serve Kamala Harris well. Kamala Harris is best served when we're talking about vibes, when we're talking about personality and emotion. You know, when you look at her favorable ratings, her personal favorability has spiked since she became the presumptive nominee in August, and but her job approval is about 7 points lower in the polling averages. So if you focus on the facts, if you focus on the policies, if she's made to answer for her past positions and her future policies as a possible president, I think voters will sour on Harris. She needs to keep it vague, abstract, and just about emotion and how warm and likable she seems to be.
She ought never to have done the Dana Bash interview then, Matt. And I've got to say, in the radio business, I've been doing this since 1990, there's a term called P1s. Those are your program's everyday listeners. And sometimes they listen longer than the average time spent listening to TSL. So your P1s for politics are you and me and the guys on the commentary pod and the folks who write editorial. The P1s know her faults, but America generally didn't like her very much before she got the nomination from an obviously incapacitated president. Do you think that the Dana Bash interview marked a moment, followed by the made up accent moment in Detroit, where they began to remember what they thought?
I think so. I mean, I think one reason why Harris had been so unpopular was that one, she was tied to an unpopular president. Two, she had had a terrible debut interview with Lester Holt of NBC News in 2021. And three, after that interview, she really went to ground. I mean, she did not do many interviews. She did not do anything to really change her, um, the impression of her among the public for years. Now, what's happened was when she became the nominee of the Democratic Party, Democrats had like this mass psychic episode where they just let out this sigh, this gigantic sigh of relief. I mean, you could still hear the wind blowing through the trees from all the relief among Democrats that they don't have to go to November with Joe Biden as their nominee. And that led to this kind of spike, this amazing vertical line jump in Kamala Harris's personal approval ratings. The challenge for the Trump campaign is to remind the American people, look, she's still tied to this unpopular president. She still has not really repudiated many of her far left radical policies from when she ran in 2020. She told Dana Bash her values are the same. There's new reporting out today, Hugh, saying that her campaign has not disavowed her former openness to reparations for slavery. I mean, this is a 70-30 issue against reparations. Her campaign is also being very coy about whether Kamala Harris still supports an vehicle mandate. That is, only electric vehicles available to the American consumer in the next 10 to 15 years. So there's still room for the Trump campaign to pin her down, to define her as a far left radical who has served in an incompetent and failed administration. They have 62 days to do that.
I don't think she has the minimum skill sets to be president, Matt. And I explained to some House guests this weekend, she doesn't have a clue on what to do about China. I really genuinely don't believe she understands what it is, the threat that it poses. The Washington Post has a huge story today on how China has been running an influence operation in San Francisco. There's a new story about China corrupting Governor Hochul and Governor Cuomo. Do you think Kamala Harris has a clue about the threat that the CCP poses?
Well, she hasn't given us many signs that she understands the threat posed by the CCP or what a Harris administration might do about it. You know, I was struck, Hugh, over the weekend by her reaction to the murder of the 6 Israeli hostages. she sent out a written statement that was quite strong against Hamas and said Hamas will pay, and blamed everything on Hamas and the murders of these 6 hostages on Hamas. But then when she was out and about doing the events with Joe Biden and then her solo event, she dropped the Hamas will pay language. I think the problem with Harris is she doesn't really know her own mind, and she's often torn between different camps of advisors internally. Remember, she's got her trusted advisors, she's got some Biden holdovers, and she also has the Obamans who have come in now and tried to recreate the 2008 magic with Harris as the candidate. She has these differing camps of advisors, but she's also always concerned about how her comments will be perceived by the broader public. That makes her very cautious. And the net product of all of this internal deliberation and indecision is kind of a muddle, a mess. And it's not clear where she stands on a lot of issues. And when you think about what's necessary for commander in chief, well, what's necessary is clarity. What's necessary is vision. What's necessary is toughness. I don't think the Harris campaign has done very well in making the American public think she possesses any of those attributes.
You know, Matt, I was on with Kudlow yesterday, and Larry asked me for what my advice to Donald Trump is, and it's very simple. Don't say anything when she's talking. Make her use all of her time. Say nothing, never take the bait, because I don't think she has the minimum skill set. And by that, I mean the key thing for a president. I worked very closely with Nixon. I knew Reagan a little bit. I've interviewed W a lot. I've interviewed Donald Trump more than any other person in the world. And I've been on a debate stage with him. They can take in information, assess it, prioritize it, and make a decision. You might not like their decisions. Decided to go into Iraq. I liked it at the time. It was a mistake. But they act on information. I don't know that she has the capacity to. This is an intellectual question. I mean, she's clearly not compromising like that. I just don't think she works very hard. I don't think she has a knowledge base. She grew up in Berkeley, went to high school and junior high in Montreal, went to Howard in D.C., and then went back to San Francisco. The world in which she grew up, the milieu in which she was raised, was not an intellectual milieu open to ideas and data. And that's why I don't think she has the minimum skill set. And she can't communicate. Do you think, let me put it differently, what would be the consequences of a 4-year Harris presidency in your view, Matt?
Well, I think the consequences of a 4-year Harris presidency would be bad for the country, bad for the world. I mean, just look at the state of things now, Hugh. We have more active conflicts going on around the globe than at any time since the Second World War. We have a mess in Ukraine. We have a mess in the Middle East. We have a mess with the Houthis. We have China ramming Philippine ships. We are treaty allies with the Philippines. We are pledged to the defense of the Philippines. We have China threatening Taiwan. So we have a very dangerous world. And then you think about the consequences of the Harris presidency domestically. I'll be frank, I don't believe anything she says when she talks about reversing her far left possessions. Now, you talked about the ideas prevalent in the Harris household. I do think there were ideas. Both of her parents were professors, but I think those ideas were left wing. I think she grew up in the Bay Area among college professors at Berkeley and Cal and the Bay Area, SFU and such. And those ideas are pretty radical. I think that's the milieu in which she came of age. And I think that's where her base is. That's where she retreats to intellectually. The whole
I
California
agree,
vibe,
Matt. It's
right?
also the most anti-Israel place in the country, in my experience, is the Bay Area. Let's go to Israel now. We have a pretty good 360 view, not into the cabinet meetings, but into the debate within Israel. We know the debate in the United States. What we don't know is Sinwar's mind. He's a psychopath, he's a sociopath, and he's a murderer who we couldn't possibly understand, but he absorbs news. What do you think his reaction is to the reactions to the execution of the 6 hostages?
Well, I think to the extent that he's aware of what's going on, he's pleased. He's pleased that the reaction of the Western world and of much of the Israeli peace camp and the broader Israeli left treated the murder, the atrocity perpetrated against these hostages as something that Bibi Netanyahu was responsible for. And that is a complete moral inversion. Hamas is responsible for everything that has happened since October 7th. And Bibi is in a position where he has acceded to the U.S. bridging proposal is what they call it, that would lead to a ceasefire. That was just 2 weeks ago. What happened? Well, Hamas rejected that bridging proposal, just like Hamas has rejected every single ceasefire proposal since last November. And instead of putting the onus of responsibility where it belongs on Hamas, we have this U.S. administration, the Harris Biden administration. And you know what? Her name should come first now because she's probably more in charge than anyone. That we have this administration blaming Netanyahu for what's happening. That's completely
Yeah,
wrong.
I think the killers in the tunnels got one message, which is it pays to kill hostages. Because all of a sudden, all the pressure went back to Netanyahu. All of a sudden, the deal that Netanyahu accepted 100% from Biden. I heard you say 8 offers accepted. I think John Podhoretz counted 9 yesterday. Whatever, Israel's always said yes. And I think Sinwar got the message that it pays to kill hostages. Is that putting it too harshly, Matt?
I believe he's always thought that, Hugh, and the fact remains that the way that we've been getting the hostages out since the initial deal back in November is by rescuing them. That's how you're going to get these hostages out, is by rescuing them. Hamas is not going to give them up. And what we've seen from these crimes over the past week is that when you get close to rescuing the hostages, if you don't pull it off, Hamas will kill them, because Hamas believes that these hostages are the only remaining leverage they have. It's despicable, it's disgusting, but what it means for the United States is that we need to be on Israel's side and to provide Israel all the means, military, intelligence, diplomatic, moral, to finish this job and to defeat Hamas and to find Sinwar and to kill him.
And then to go north. Matt, I have Senator Vance coming up next hour, and I prepared an outline of questions. I'm not going to play this until after he's been on because I don't give my questions away, and I don't think they're softball. I want to know, first of all, what you think of my opening question and then what you would like asked. My opening question is, does it matter that Governor Walz went to China 30 times? And do we need to know the details of those trips and his relationship with the CCP? Is that a good question? Is that one that needs to be asked?
I think it's a legitimate question. I'm not sure that Senator Vance will have the answer, but I am sure he'll agree with you, Hugh, that this is a question that needs to be asked. There's a lot of Governor Walz's background we just don't know, that we're just unfamiliar with. And this particular aspect of the background, his relationship with China, all of the travel he did there, who paid for the trips, what was going on the trips, I think that's legitimate to want to know on when you're talking about someone who could be the next vice president and potential president of the United States.
The reason I'm going to ask him is in order to elevate the question in the media so that it might get asked at the debate. What would you ask Senator Vance yourself if you were talking to him this morning, Matt, and you wanted to elicit from him news?
Well, what do I want to know from Senator Vance? I want to know what he's found most challenging about running for president or running for vice president, and whether he feels as though his message is really getting out there. You know, he's given a lot of interviews, Hugh. Senator Vance is very accessible, but his approval ratings have not really gone up to match the success, I think, of his communications campaign. So I'm wondering if he feels that that's a challenge and what he thinks he might want to do to improve his standing among the American people, or whether he even thinks that's necessary, because I do think he's performing the main role of a running mate, which is to be the attack dog, very well.
Yeah, I do not believe anyone votes for vice president. I do believe vice presidents can make news, which is why I'm starting with Walz China, but I will ask him about that. I'm also going to ask him about what I perceive the Harris Walz interview. It was such a bad interview, and Dan is my friend. But the obvious question is, was Israel justified in attacking Lebanon preemptively? Would they be justified in attacking Iran preemptively if Iran prepares another attack? Those were obvious questions, Matt. They didn't get asked. I'm going to ask him that. Do you think the legacy media is redeemable at this point? Because Dana is about as good as it gets in the legacy media world. She went after J.D. Vance with a meat hook, and she just threw softballs at Kamala Harris. Is it possible for legacy media to be seriously fair anymore?
I don't think so. I think if you just trace the events of this calendar year and look at how the mainstream media institutions went from saying Joe Biden's doing fine, and when the Wall Street Journal publishes this article raising questions about his condition, everyone else in the media comes down on the Wall Street Journal news reporters, to saying that Joe Biden should maybe think about stepping down, to saying that if Joe Biden doesn't step down, he's going to be, the criminal in American history, going to be treated as a criminal, to when he does step down, saying, "Oh, now he's George Washington." And then when you look at the mainstream
Oh,
media,
you know what? You just gave me a new first question. Are we in a
yeah,
constitutional crisis? Because I think we are, Matt. I think we're in a constitutional
well,
crisis.
I
Have you done
agree. And
that
then
bit?
look at how the media went from saying Harris is a liability to now Harris is the best thing since sliced bread. So
Well said.
these mainstream media don't have any credibility.